You're listening to The Outcue, a 21 News journalist perspective on a top news story.
Good afternoon. This is the final edition of The Outcue for 2024. I'm Assistant News Director Justin Mitchell, and as we talked about last week, this has been an extraordinarily busy year. So last week, Robert and I went through some of the high and low lights of the biggest stories of the year, and I think even going through it and having already compiled them, we were surprised at how big they were. So that's just two people's perspectives. What I wanted to do this week as our farewell for the year is to bring in just a few of our reporters to just talk briefly about what their most memorable stories they covered were and what made them memorable. So we'll do it one at a time. We're going to have three of them on. The first one is going to be Chris Cerenelli. So Chris, there's been so much, I have no idea what story you're going to mention, but what was the one most memorable for you this year?
Well, an ode to Mona Alexander, and certainly an embarrassment of riches, as she likes to say, in terms of our local news gathering and the implications that it had on a state and national scale as well, depending on what story you're talking about. The two that come to mind immediately for me, of course, the Realty Building. Just the breadth and depth of coverage that we devoted to that, the resources we devoted to that, the impact that it had on the heart of downtown Youngstown, the ripple effect. I mean, we could sit here, as you have alluded to, for other stories for a half hour and just devote it to that. But, just on a personal note, growing up in Youngstown and having, always known about that building and the history of it, and then to see it go that way was very tragic. The gentleman who died, very, very tragic. All of the injuries, certainly tragic. I mean, it was terrible. And, you look for ways to do it justice, and you just put your head down and do the journalism. But I mean, it's one of those that you cannot ignore the personal aspect of that.
So the personal aspect of it for you was the thing that was the most memorable, because there were so many facets to it. I mean, there was the city's involvement and the companies but there were so many real people just affected. Between the young man who was killed, the people who were injured, the people who lost their homes, the people from International Towers next door that were displaced, the businesses affected because they were closed indefinitely.
It was a catastrophe, really.
It really truly was.
The ripple effect, like I said, just can't be overstated.
It really can't. Any one particular angle or story that stands out for you?
I remember talking to the boyfriend of Caroline
Pizarro.
Yeah,
yes.
A day or two after it happened, and just hearing her story, hearing about the struggle that they were getting to not only just make sure that she survived, but that she was able to get the care she needed, that she was able to keep her home and their personal affairs in order. How it, we talk about how it disrupted, the downtown and the city as a whole. I mean, the disruption to someone's life. I mean, my God.
Yeah, we've spoken to them a few times, not for stories since then, and yeah, I mean, you're never the same.
Absolutely. So I mean, it's hard for us to convey that, in the 2 minutes that we get on the air, or that in a couple of web articles or what have you. But that one certainly sticks out, and the other one was the Vienna fiscal mess.
Yes.
We are constantly going to meetings. We're constantly watching taxpayer money. We're constantly, trying to be the watchdog, to use our branding for that, which is part of what journalism is supposed to be. I remember being at that first meeting where it came out exactly how bad it was, and they handed us out these ditto sheets, and the two other reporters who were in the room with me, there was a collective as we each read down the paper. With each line we got further into it, our eyes just got bigger and bigger and bigger, and by the time we got to the end, I'm like, oh my God.
Yeah, because we knew going in from some sources that there was something coming down and that it was bad.
Yeah.
But I mean, I remember looking at the story that night and going, I had no idea it was headed here. I mean,
Exactly.
It was worse than we possibly thought. We just knew that there might be some money that was in question.
Yep. And it turned out to be, a story that has still not resolved itself. Just this past week, we have had, kind of a status update as to where things stand and how they're going to get out of fiscal emergency and how long it's going to take. And
not to mention that the fiscal officer has been indicted, and
Correct.
that case has to play its way through.
Correct.
And Robert and I mentioned last week that, we know what her side of the story is, and she's not been convicted of anything, so this could still get very complicated. I mean, if they found, let's say that they found that she was not at fault legally. Well, then there's a whole other potential scenario that's got to be played through.
Absolutely.
All right, Chris. Well, we're going to bring the next reporter on here, but a special kudos for being the first person to hand out a ditto sheet that I've heard since maybe a grade school teacher.
Yeah, someone else gets it. It's good to know.
So now joining us is reporter and anchor Madison Tromler, who is often one that is off of the street day to day because she works on a lot of the deeper dive stories. And so I wanted to get your perspective, Madison, on this has been a busy year for both Spot News and deep dive stuff. So first of all, just what stood out the most for you? What was the most memorable thing you worked on this year?
I would say, well, I kind of have two, but I would say the two most memorable moments, both working on 101 West, because I think really this year that has taken off so much. We've gotten to do so much in-depth reporting. So I think traveling to DC twice, first we did 101 West on the East Palestine train derailment. We looked deeper into derailments and federal rail safety, and so many people locally had so many questions. And we got to do an interview with the NTSB chair, Jennifer Homendy, and I think it was a very well-received interview, and that was big for that story. And then also, sort of recently, we did a deep dive into how frequent natural gas explosions are after the Realty building explosion. And we also got to interview a prominent figure on the NTSB board. So I think just being able to travel and do those, get those interviews for those important stories was just really special.
So what stood out for you in those that made them the most memorable?
I would say being able to sit down and ask the questions to Jennifer Homendy that people had been wanting to know the answers to, and getting some new information, and really just being able to share these interviews that we worked really hard on getting. I think just like working hard on getting that interview, that was that moment where, they have a really busy schedule, and we had been working on these stories for months and months, and, I would say, in the past few years, those two situations, the derailment, the building explosion, were probably arguably one of the two biggest stories, in recent years here locally.
In many years, yes.
Yeah, so, to be able to hold people accountable in the situation, and also ask the people who are investigating those very situations, who are doing the investigation right on the ground, and to be able to, bring those interviews back and get them down to the local level was just super memorable.
So it really is it's that digging. I mean, you've got to love that to do this. This is hard. This is really tedious and hard sometimes. Yeah. But like you mentioned, it was hard to get some of these interviews, but they were the people who had the answers that everybody needed. So you just can't take no for an answer. You can't quit on it. So that's it. Yeah. And plus, for me, with both of those, I can't believe how much we learned about industries we didn't know about, but that potentially could affect our health and safety on any given day.
Yes, and we prepared so long and did so much research. So when we finally got those interviews, and it was, I think, towards the end of both of those investigations that we ended up doing those interviews, for example, with Jennifer Homendy. But it was just the icing on the cake of all of this research we had done. And we learned so much, and to be able to include her in there and really, I think, drive the whole thing home. And we did, like you said, work really hard on the research, and we prepared our questions so much. And then when we finally got her to really be able to speak in depth on some things, I think after it aired, from some of the messages I received, I think it did really resonate with a lot of viewers to hear her. She kind of became a familiar face in our area from the natural gas explosion and from the derailment. She had, been here and has been someone who people were starting to recognize. So I think that was important that we really had her in there.
Well, and because she had the information, and, because, look, I think, I can only speak for myself, but we're kind of past the point where you get starry-eyed and go, oh, that's a big interview, unless you can get good info out of it. Because that 101 West, I've mentioned this before, we also had a one-on-one with Pete Buttigieg, who we have interviewed about East Palestine, but particularly for 101 West, the depth of the answers was not, it was a lot of stuff we knew. The answers were fine, but we weren't breaking new ground with that interview, so it didn't make the cut.
Right, absolutely. And and I have interviewed, people like Pete Buttigieg or people who are arguably much more prominent, maybe known figures, but they're not necessarily as very openly as candid as she was. And
Right.
she was so candid, so open. So I think that's what made it so memorable. And I just remember specifically getting one email, and I believe it was someone local who wrote out sort of just a little essay to me on why and it's nice to hear this from a viewer, someone who's not a journalist, but someone who recognizes, when they watch something and it resonates with them. And she said she just enjoyed watching it, and she felt it was really conversational, and how well Jennifer Homendy had answered the questions, and it just made me happy to know people were watching that on YouTube and stuff. So not only was it memorable that we got to go and travel and interview, her as a figure, but to sit down and have a casual yet in-depth and candid conversation about a very serious issue in our area was very memorable and very important.
Madison, thanks for taking the time. I'm going to get one more in here so that we don't go as far obnoxiously overboard as Robert and I did last week. All right, and the last one we're going to bring on today, I could bring everybody in the newsroom up here, as well as producers and the news director and every videographer, but so nobody should feel slighted. I just grabbed the first three people I found in the newsroom, and the third one was somebody who just started reporting this year for us, and so I know it's been a memorable year. You've done a lot. It's Kaitlyn McCarthy. So Kaitlyn, first of all, just what was the most memorable thing you worked on this year? Because you've had some big ones.
I have. I think the most memorable for me, and it's probably just because I've been working on it for a while, but it was with the Realty building when they were having, after the explosion, particularly the one where we had the pictures of the people dressed as construction workers that were taking out those items. Yeah, I always think about that story.
Yeah. Well, yeah, when Chris was here a few minutes ago, he also mentioned the Realty, because how could you not? But what he said was that it was the personal stories that really were most memorable to him, because there were so many angles. It was what the city was doing, it was what the construction company was doing, it was how the businesses were affected. So it's interesting that, everybody might mention Realty, because Madison mentioned it too, but in another way. So Chris mentioned it, and it was the personal stories. And Madison mentioned it, and it was in the getting to the bottom of the regulation of the natural gas industry. So this is another angle here that Robert and I talked about a little bit last week. But what about that? You say you still remember it all the time. What about it made it memorable?
Well, that personally actually was important to me because it made me realize the kind of journalism that I felt was super important, and that was investigative journalism. That got me kind of into that, and that's why, to me, anytime I'm doing any kind of investigative, journalism piece, I always kind of refer back to that, because that took a lot of work, not just from me, but also just from everybody in the newsroom. I mean, we spent so much time getting sources, and I think a lot of it also was the stories that we were hearing around. So I think the combination of those two has really just made that the most memorable story for me.
Well, and I think it also just stood out because it seemed like it couldn't be right? Like there's no way that people are taking personal items out of that building. And then we went on to find out that yes, they were, and the contract allowed them to do it, and the city approved the contract.
Yeah, I know, and you're exactly right. When I first saw these pictures, I'm like, this can't be real. It felt like an unreal moment, but no, that was definitely something that I felt that is very important to put out there so people are aware.
There's actually a couple moments that are memorable to me from that particular angle, which is because people don't think it. They see these shots on TV where they see a reporter doing an interview or trying to get an interview, and this is a little bit of a diversion, but it's not. But I want to. There was those moments where the construction crew was working, and you see the supervisor, and we know who he is from the company's website, from some of the photos we've seen. We know his name, and we want to give them an opportunity to talk to us, and they won't come over to you. So you've got to yell his name and try and get him to come over. Now, you don't know how that's going to go. He could be very hostile. He could refuse to talk to you. He could the other way. He could, we don't know this person, and this is not an elected official or somebody that is going to act within a certain scope. We know nothing about this guy other than who he is and what the company does. So what I want you to tell me about is what you remember about those moments and anticipating how to ask and what your contingency plans in your head are for what happens depending upon how he reacts.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it also just to kind of back up a little bit, also depends on the mindset. You can't go in there immediately just attacking and hostile. I mean, of course he's not going to answer that.
Mm-hmm.
You don't know who that person is, like you said. That could end really badly. I wouldn't want to do that. So to me personally, you have to do that more, kind approach and go more forward with that. And I think the big idea is to just realize that, hey, you have to be able to at least ask him this and give him a fair chance to answer.
Fairness, that's the point there, is that this was not accusatory. Mm-hmm. Their position on this all along, and it's why it was in the contract and it's why the city approved it, was that the building was not inhabitable. It wasn't safe for anybody to be in there except for the people who were experts in how to demolish it. And so everything in it was part of a demolition scene. It was basically going to be in a pile of rubble. And so they really didn't see anything necessarily wrong with taking things out that would otherwise have ended up in a landfill. And that was their position. And you can understand that, mm-hmm. but you can certainly also understand the position of a resident who says, I was told I can't get my stuff, and now I find out that somebody was able to get in there and take it out, but they didn't give it to me.
Absolutely. Oh my gosh. Yeah, that was crazy. Yeah, it was definitely like a both, taking both sides and kind of realizing, what the situation is. Of course, you don't want to put something out there and only ask, just ask the residents or just ask the construction workers. So
I wish that they would have talked to us. I still wish that they would talk to us.
Oh, me too.
At some point.
I really did. I really tried. They're really, they just didn't want to talk, and that's just kind of how it was.
How many days did you go down there and try and get him? There were several in a row, I recall.
At least three. At least three
in a row, because there were updates on the story.
Oh yeah, I did for multiple stories. It wasn't just that one.
Right.
It was throughout that whole process.
Well, Kaitlyn, I thank you for that. I thank Chris. I thank Madison. And I thank Andy back there. I thank Robert. I thank Sheila. I thank our newsroom. But mostly, I thank all of you. This Outcue was launched earlier this year. It has grown. It's built a steady audience. And it was started with the idea that people think they know the news, but they really only know what they consume. They don't know what goes into it, and they deserve to know. They deserve to know that when someone says things like, we're all the media now, that's not an innocuous statement. That if we're all the media now, but we don't all have the knowledge of how to pursue stories fairly, thoroughly, and accurately, well, then the media has lost a whole lot of credibility. We need to remind people of what goes into real journalism, and we need to keep that work up. This was never launched, and it won't continue to be launched to pat ourselves on the back. It's to let you know that there's real work that you don't see that goes into it, that there is probably 9 hours worth of work for every minute you see on the air, and that it's important, and it might be more important now than it's ever been, because there will always be people in power. There will always be the possibility for power to corrupt, because that's what it does. And there will always need to be someone who's looking out for you as an intermediary between the powerful and you, who deserve better than to be taken advantage of. That's what this job of ours is all about. That's what this podcast is all about explaining. So I hope you've had a better 2024 than some of the people that have been subjects of these news stories have been. And I hope that you have a prosperous and healthy 2025. We'll continue to do this work. And as always, if you need to reach out to us, or if there's anything you think we should be looking into, or any topics about the news that you would like to hear more about, that you would like to see us do an Outcue episode on, you can reach us in the comments. You can like and subscribe. You can email us at news@wfmj.com, watchdog@wfmj.com. You can call our newsroom at 330-744-8821. You can message us on Facebook. You can reach us on Blue Sky. There are lots of ways to reach us. You can even send us mail, but it's the longest way to get us things, so please don't. Until next year and on into the future, this has been the Outcue.